I saw it as the sort of the ball passed to Cecilia at the institutional level. And again, I have to say, in the survey which we were running, there were comments that harmonization of regulations would help. There were colleagues from Sweden saying, well, we would benefit from a little bit more sort of formal regulations, but it's about the capacity, about consistency of decisions made by the people dealing with the recognition across the university. There is a number of challenges with the resources and awareness of both staff and the students. So how you address these issues at your institution? Because at the end, the institutions are responsible for the recognition.
Yeah, as Malmö being the youngest university in Sweden, and we started out 1998 with a mission to go into widening participation and access. So we have been working quite a long time. And I would say when we got the refugee situation here in the 2015-16, that made us much more aware of how we could work and have to work with RPL. And having then a very good system, we realized that we need to work with our academic staff. And I think it was a really good example here with Susanna, that I think combining the Bologna and the way we have set up our learning outcome goals together with the RPL, the way you have shown here today as very, very good, solid system, I think we could really move forward. But that also means that you have engaged the academic staff that usually do other types of course, tasks that's related to the university. So now you have to take that group and saying, like we said this morning, that you are the best on evaluation and setting up, different kinds of framework for criteria. But that is almost impossible to do outside what you regularly do in the university. So that's why we said that there is a challenge that we need to have resources to have these academics together with the administration, because this is a joint work that has to be joint, but it also needs to have a financial support. And I think it's also some sort of a philosophy related to seeing diversity as a quality factor in higher education. We're going to have to solve the challenges of society, and we need everyone. We need really to have a diverse student population that can also address global issues. And I would also agree with Pedji that you said that it's actually internationalization. It is internationalization at home. Without having that, we wouldn't have as good internationalization at home today. And I also think what we see now with the corona and having a really rescaling, upscaling need from society, and that is from different groups in society, the higher education institutions need to really rethink about flexible education, how you can do that in a way to have people restructuring their competencies with the goals that you do get through higher education. So I will also say that there is a shift on the reason why we do have higher education institutions in relation to supporting the social workforce, the workforce generally workforce, but also I agree with Philippe. I mean, it's both the public employers, but also the nonprofit employers that our students need to have sort of a reflect of to get the optimal wide university that can actually serve society and provide those change agents that our students actually should be.
Thank you. And again, my apologies that we can't go further into the experience. And I believe that one of the conclusions of the entire project is that we need more exchange, we need more peer learning, and that's probably something that we are going to address at the European level. Well, that's amazing that some projects were initiated, and I think we got a great experience. But now let's see what the students see within the recognition of prior learning. How all of that sounded to you, Peggy? How do students expect the recognition to develop further on? And what would be the key elements for you for the future? How to sort of ensure the awareness, trust, acceptance of these flexible pathways?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So from the student's perspective on the international level, I just want to mention that we have conducted the research on the topic of recognition for the year 2020. And what we recognize actually is the need for the higher transparency and simplicity of the process, which is consistent with your report, which states that raising awareness among the staff and the students and better support should be highly encouraged. And we also think that this is relevant not only in the national context, but also at the European level, but in particular in regards to the third country nationals, so from which also come from the European higher education area. We also see that there is a need for the harmonization of recognition procedures, which sounds really, really relevant and important to us. And it's also quite necessary to develop this more as it is reported, because we have the results that state that actually 49% of the students identified that the mobility the recognition of prior learning within the mobility process is much more easier than the recognition of prior learning for the continuation of education or for entrance to the labor market. We also recognize that there is an interinstitutional lack of trust, which plays an important role in the process. So even when we have developed frameworks, the national qualifications frameworks as well, and they are implemented as well on the national levels, we still have this lack of trust between the institutions to kind of agree that something will be recognized or not. So we also recognize that there are some legal barriers which are from the governmental level in the national context, preventing that some of the recognition processes are made more accessible or more easy. So how do the students actually see the processes of the recognition of prior learning? So the students usually trust the process more if there are some bilateral or multilateral agreements signed between the institutions. However, there are some barriers still present. For example, if the student goes somewhere, does the exchange, does the mobility, comes back, and then at the institution, the process becomes quite slow, drags a little bit. Sometimes it's not even recognized, and this kind of the student will then lose a little bit of trust in the institution itself as well. So as I mentioned also before, with the rise of the internationalization practices, recognition became more open towards students from other countries. However, there's always a question of the difference in the quality of teaching and learning, which will be offered, and will a certain knowledge be valuable to other institutions that will access their prior learning as well. So this is why we are really, really encouraging that these processes are somehow harmonized at different levels. So what do we see as some of the key benefits and concerns? So I would define that the key benefits are a step towards building a European identity by supporting this recognition of prior learning processes, making them more transparent and more inclusive and accessible. Then education without borders as well, because this is, I think, something that we are trying to achieve, that we have one system where all of our experts will be able to tap into and really connect. Developing national qualifications framework, as I said, is extremely important. There are still countries that didn't implement this or are in the processes of changing them. It would be, of course, they're in line with the EQFs, but it would be also good if they would kind of be harmonized, like in the sense of how the process of recognition is actually being conducted. So some of the concerns also rise from this, for example, how implemented will the recognition of prior learning processes be in a few years if certain measures are brought up in accessibility or a transparency way, or the building trust between the institutions as well. So what we want to see is lessening maybe the bureaucratic burden and the administration process for the applicant itself. And then there is a big discrepancy which we see between the approaches for the recognition of prior learning. In some countries, the government is the one who is doing the recognition. In some countries, we have the Enic-NARICS, we have the combination of the two. Then we also have some information that in some countries, even labor market stakeholders are able to do the recognition of prior learning for the entrance to the labor market. So it would be really good to see these approaches kind of strategized a little bit more, and so that more importance is given to the Enic-NARIC offices as well. So as well, if we look at the vulnerability and less traditional students, how would their voice be reflected? So we actually think that their voice is not being heard enough, but also we are now in the situation where we really had to struggle to achieve a system which will be adapted to the pandemic situation. So I really think that there will still be place to discuss these things, especially when we were talking about the accessibility of higher education, and the internationalization practices are showing to be more inclusive than the education was before. But we think that often, even when we are considering recognition of prior learning, the processes are still not accessible enough. The students still don't have the access to all of the information in one place. Usually they have to go and search for the information themselves. And most often even the recognition procedures are not being explained to the students at their institutional level. And I see this also in the student representation, that the student representatives also are not so often introduced to the topic of recognition of prior learning, and that's why they tend to avoid these topics a little bit, because they seem to expert-like. They seem that this is not something for the students but for the professionals. And I actually think that it's really good if we involve the students, and not only from the perspective of providing information from the students to the students from these professionals at the international level, but also because I think that the students can give a really good feedback whether something is accessible, whether something is transparent, or how easy is the process, because they're the ones who will be using it most probably in the future.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that we are a little bit getting out of time. I would I saw that Jean-Philippe wanted to comment something briefly. If any of the panelists would like to have a very brief comment, because we are getting to wrap up, and I'm sorry, there's a lot of comments running in the chat. We will take that on board, but I'm afraid that we are not able to address how the sustainable development goals will be reflected within higher education. What are the challenges of bringing together the different actors? But we will see. Oh, I got a few more minutes. Yeah. So, Jean-Philippe, you wanted to say something? Cecilia?
Yeah, in fact, about one of the comments. I want to mention also, and this is coming also from the first festival of validation, which was organized in Brussels some years ago, that in terms of the advice and support to learner to have this prior recognition of prior learning, we need also to be faced that that it is a market, and that there are people who want to make money from this approach, which of course we need to also to find that this work is a public services, that any learner can find the area in which he can be follow, work with him or her to have this recognized as a services, as a public services. And I would say that even if there are costs, that the cost cannot be only on the shoulder of the learner, especially when it goes to reorientation, new job, or even for people who are in refugee situation, etc. So here I will say it needs to be an investment also from public authorities in different terms to allow any learner to enter to this process.
Thank you, Jean-Philippe. And I saw that Koen has started commenting in the chat that the member states were invited to bring all the stakeholders into the process. Thanks, Koen. I also like the comment from Adrina saying, well, that we should take into account that harmonization doesn't mean sort of playing the same tune, but contributing to the similar melody or the similar song with understanding how that fits together. Cecilia, you wanted to comment on something. Please go ahead briefly.
Yeah. on that it's easier for universities to actually use RPL for access to education. There are some excellent examples from France where you actually are recognizing a whole degree. And I think those are two extremes where we are going to be discussing quite a long time in higher education. When, like Peggy also said, that we have a hard time to acknowledge education coming from different institutions, even in the same country. So I'm wondering, with the French perspective, which has also been in the French law for a very long time, I agree again, I think it has to be a law regulation, even if we can do a lot. I mean, we have a really good space to be able to accomplish quite a bit. But in those perspectives where we actually would also recognize a whole degree, we have a long, long way to go in how I think the general idea is that if you go through higher education, you really have to go through the whole program, the way it is set up at that institution. So I think it's a cultural and it's also a regulated discussion we need to have.
I muted myself. Oh, thank you very much. I think this was basically the full stop at the end of the discussion, which could have lasted longer. Thank you very much. I would still remind that one of the conclusions which we found during the process is there's a vast space for learning. And when I was preparing for this session, I discussed the topic with a colleague who was engaged in formal Bologna RPL structure in 2010-2012. And we came to the conclusion that at that time, it might have been for a number of countries in higher education too early, that we are now coming to the moment when there is more space for sharing for different experience. And I think we should sort of keep that going on, because despite the need for harmonization of regulations, we need sort of to pass the message to the practitioners, because that's where at the end the things are happening. At the end of the session, I would like to thank all the panelists. Sorry for keeping your time short, and thank you for your contributions. But I would also like to use the opportunity to thank the participants and for the attendance. And before giving the floor to Anders, I would like to say that I'm so happy that we were part of this project, which was really amazing. Unfortunately, a big part of the project was on a virtual basis. So I hope that we will continue in a further period, having also the opportunity to meet together on one site physically. And thanks to Anders as the coordinator. I think the project was a really amazing experience for us and the step to further work. Anders, that's now time to give the floor to you for the final session. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Michal, Cecilia, Diane, Koen, Peggy, Jean-Philippe. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. And well, of course, you could have gone on talking about this for an hour more, I think, but sometimes you need to stop when it's most fun and most interesting. But so you have to sort of stop when you're on top. So thank you very much for this.